Good morning, everybody. Or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I'm coming from the East Coast, so in the US, so good morning. Welcome to the first AMA of the 2024 series. The AMA series is presented by the International Mind, Brain, and Education Society with the aim of building connections among IMBIS trainees and non-trainee practitioners and researchers to support the translation of research into policy and practice. It's also an effort to expand our community and welcome new names and faces into the space. So if this is your first IMBIS event, we are very glad you're here and welcome. I'm Anna. I am the research chair of the IMBIS trainee board, and I'm going to be moderating this AMA today. And the other IMBIS trainee board members will introduce themselves in the chat. So if you have any questions, you can DM any of us. And please introduce yourself in the chat as well and let us know your role, whether you're a researcher, educator, involved in policy. We would love to get some data on who is attending our AMAs. So these are recorded and we're going to share them on YouTube later, and watch out for the announcement for that on Twitter and our website. If you have registered, you're going to get an email with the recording as well. We have 2 ASL interpreters, and live transcription is enabled, I think. Chris, if you could do live transcription, that would be amazing. So please take advantage of those services. And we're going to start with a 15-minute presentation from our speaker, Andrew Watson, on his work, followed by a 15-minute facilitated discussion. And then we're going to move on to a 15-minute Ask Me Anything session with questions from the audience. So write down your questions and put them in the chat so we can ask them for you. Some vocab clarification. MBE stands for Mind, Brain, and Education. Andrew may speak to that or other education research more broadly. We have very diverse participants, so we want to be inclusive. Ask if you're unsure, and we can clarify any vocabulary in the chat. So now I'm going to introduce our very first speaker of the 2024 season, Andrew Watson, MA EDM, began teaching in 1988, studying psychology and neuroscience, and combined those interests in 2012. He's taught high school English for 20 years and now translates brain science for teachers, students, administrators, and parents. As a consultant, Andrew has partnered with schools and presented at conferences nationally and internationally, focusing on memory, attention, and motivation. His goal is to use research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience to make learning easier and teaching more effective. Since 2016, Andrew has written and edited the Learning and Brain blog and has written 3 books, The Goldilocks Map, Learning Begins, and Learning Grows. So we can get started whenever you're ready, Andrew, and thank you so much for kicking off our 2024 AMAs.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be any speaker, much less the first speaker. So I'm feeling especially happy about that this morning. So as you heard, I have worked as a high school English teacher for a couple hundred years now, and I got interested in this intersection of psychology and neuroscience and education. I went to a conference in 2008 where someone said out loud, you know, learning happens in the mind. And once you say that, it's, wait a minute, you know, as an English teacher, I'd never heard that before. But if it's true that learning happens in the mind, then probably it's really helpful for people who teach to know more about how the mind works. How does memory work? How does attention work? How does motivation work? And maybe a little neuroscience as well. We'll get to that in a moment. So I was intrigued by that question and I was all in, and I took all the courses and read all the books and got a fancy degree. And I've been talking with teachers about this for more than 10 years now. So increasingly in recent years, I've been a little worried about the direction of this field that we're in. As I understand the genesis of the mind-brain education field, I think the reason it's named that way, mind-brain education, that means psychology, neuroscience teachers, I think it's named that way as an implication that all of these people are equal partners in the conversation. We all get a voice, we all get to talk to each other. And my concern is this has happened, which is to say we live at a cultural moment when research is a very powerful thing. So I don't exactly think it's the researchers telling teachers what to do. I think it's people saying, hey, everybody, hey, you teachers, the research says this, and therefore you have to do that. And you are merely teachers and you don't get to question. Research says, therefore you must. And this worries me a lot because as a teacher, I think our experience matters. I think our training matters. I think our understanding of the classroom matters. So my big picture goal is to go from this back to this, which is how I think the field was initially envisioned as an even contribution. We're all having this conversation together. So one of my goals in this process is to give teachers a clearer way of thinking about understanding exactly how research works and how we can be a part of a conversation. So if somebody says, the research says this, you really must, we get to say, oh, thank you, that's helpful. I'd like getting research-based advice, and I have a few questions. So what I want to do is offer up some questions that we might ask so we can be, so it's not this, it's not the research telling us what's to do. We're having a conversation here, and that's the format I'm hoping is helpful. By the way, if you're a teacher, then you're perhaps hearing what I'm saying. If your focus is more on research, then I think what might be interesting about what I'm about to say is you might think, really? Teachers didn't know that? And yes, there are a great many things that we as teachers don't really know about how research works. So I think what you might be getting from this is a sense of the teacher's sort of baseline of understanding of their research process. As you all know, it is impossible to share screen on Zoom without talking about it. So I'm talking about it. Okay. And Kristen, give me a thumbs up. Okay, thank you. There we go. Here, a slide. Excellent. I'm feeling good. Okay. So as you know, I'm interested in this balance question. How can we be an equal participant in this set of conversations? And I want to start with the sort of teaching advice that we might get. So as a teacher, I go to a PD day and the consultant says, we have lots and lots of research that tells us that when you shake hands with students at the door as they enter the classroom, all sorts of good things happen for connection and attention and learning and memory. So you really should have a school policy that it should happen that teachers should shake hands with students as they come in. And I could have picked anything. The advice could be begin every class with retrieval practice. It could be mindful meditation should be a core part of what you do. It could be students should never take notes on a laptop. They should always take notes by hand. Whatever, like lots and lots of advice, but the heading is always the research shows and therefore you must. So when we get one of these, the research shows and therefore you must, I've actually written a book about this. So there are all sorts of fun steps. There's this whole quest that we could go on for the buried treasure and the dragon and the giant and all that. But rather than sort of race in 15 or 20 minutes, instead of racing through all of those steps, I'm just going to pick a couple of them to give you some of the ideas, the sorts of questions that we might ask, the sorts of ways of thinking about research that might be helpful. So we're going to basically do three steps together. We're going to start by investigating the person I call the source. And what I mean by source is, well, somebody said to you, you have to change the way you teach because research says so. So I'm going to call that person the source, just to have a word to call that person. And then if it turns out that the source is behaving in a respectable, responsible way, I'm going to keep going and I'm going to look at the research, the research that the source has given me. And if that turns out to be good, I'm going to go beyond just that one bit of research that the source gave me. I'm going to expand my vision and look at a lot of different research. And again, many other steps we could do, but these are the three steps we're gonna do together today. So how is it if someone comes and says, change the way you teach, research says so, what's the first thing we do? And you are, I suspect, not going to believe how easy this first step is. It's shockingly easy and it's really powerful. So when someone comes to you and says, change the way you teach, research says so, I think the first thing we should do is say, that is so helpful. I really appreciate it. That's just great. Thank you. What's the best research you know of that supports that suggestion? And you will be genuinely stunned the number of times you get an evasive answer to that question. I was at a conference this last weekend. Someone was talking to me. The PD speaker said the thing. After the talk, she said, thank you so much. What's the best research? And the PD presenter looked at her with evident irritation and said, well, you could just Google it. And my own thinking is, well, actually, no. If you are telling, if the speaker is telling teachers we have to do something because of research, it's the speaker's job to tell us what the research is. That's not an unreasonable question. So no, we don't have to Google it. The person who's telling us we have to do it has to give it to us. And the refusal to give it to us, which is remarkably common, lets us know we actually don't have to do what this person just said. If they can't tell us what the research is, why would we follow their research-based advice? It's probably not research-based. So is the first step really that simple? Believe it or not, the first step really is that simple. Now, I do want to examine a subset, so that first step will always happen. This next step doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. So let's imagine the speaker says, shake hands, it does all these good things. And I say, that's so helpful. What's the best research you know of? And the speaker says, I'm so glad you asked. It's really wonderful you're curious because we have this amazing study. We've got this fMRI stuff. We've got the oxytocin. We've got the dopamine. There are things in the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Like, oh, it's great research. Here you go. You should go explore this research. So let me quit out of this for just a second. So let's pretend for a tiny moment that I am a neurologist, and what I do for a living is I study migraine headaches. And to be clear, that's not true. I'm an end user of migraine headaches, but I don't investigate them. But let's say I do this, and I notice this pattern among my patients that nobody has ever noticed before. I look at the fMRI, and I look at the EEG, and I study the neurotransmitters and the synapses, and I look at the ventral tegmental area and the nodes of Ranvier. I'm doing all the cool neuroscience-y things. And I notice a pattern that when my patients have this particular kind of migraine headache, there's sort of a neural signature that goes along with that particular kind of thing. So I think, well, here's what I want to do. I want to disrupt that neural signature. So I develop the medication and I develop the exercise, and there's the stretch and the sleep. There's a whole the Watson method. So I test the medication on the mice, and it's perfectly safe, and that's good. And then I test the system, the Watson system, on the patients, and it works. It changes their neural signature. This is awesome. So I sell the Watson system, and I make $1 million. I think I skipped a step. I forgot to ask if their migraine headaches went away. Because it actually doesn't matter to the patient if the neural stuff changed. They don't care about the dopamine. They don't care about they care, did the headache stop? That's what they care about. So if the neural signature changed and the headache didn't go away, well, I'm glad that my thing had the neural signature effect. That's good. But ultimately, it's not a successful treatment because their headache is still there. And by the way, the flip side of that is still true. Let's say my Watson system doesn't change the neural signature, but the headache does go away. Well, then they should do it, right? It fixed the headache problem. The patient doesn't care about the underlying neuroscience-y stuff. The patient cares about the headache. So it worked, even though it didn't change the neural signature, right? So this analog happens all the time in education, where people say, well, look at the dopamine and therefore change the way you teach. And my response is, okay, fine, dopamine, but actually, have you tested to determine whether or not your teaching method has the effect that you want it to have? Does doing the thing, which might or might not change the dopamine, does it help students learn more? Does it help them pay attention more? Does it help them remember more? Does it help them connect with each other? Whatever it is. Does the neuroscience thing have the effect that you want it to have? And for the most part, the discipline that studies that isn't neuroscience. For the most part, it's psychology. So going back to my slides, it's not possible to switch to Zoom without talking about slides. So if somebody says something like this to you, with all that cool biological, ooh, so much biology, they said oxytocin, it must be true. What you want to do is say, okay, thank you. That was really helpful. Love the neuroscience. It's always fascinating. do you know of any psychology research where they actually tested this with students in classrooms? And if the answer to that question is yes, now we're feeling like, okay, now I'm starting to trust this person. I'm feeling good. Let's keep going. So step one, to check out how trustworthy the source is, are they willing to share with you what the research is? And are they willing to share specifically psychology research over and above the neuroscience research? Now, the second step, once we've decided we trust the source, well, what about this research itself? And the headline here is it's always important to understand the particulars of what actually happened in this research. And one of my very favorite studies, when we consider the questions, well, who in the study did, what did they do? There's a well-known study published in a well-known journal about parachutes and the effect that parachutes have when you jump out of airplanes. And the conclusion of this study is that parachutes provide no benefit. They do not keep you alive. They do not prevent major injury. Parachutes make no difference when you jump from airplanes. And this is, in fact, published research. So if I ask the speaker, is there research, they'll say yes. So if, because we're doing step here, we look at the particulars of this, well, what we see is that the participants jumped from an average altitude of 0.6 meters, which is like this, and the velocity at which the airplanes were traveling was on average 0.0 kilometers per hour. They were jumping from stationary planes parked on the ground. So yes, it's true in this particular context that wearing a parachute provides no benefit. But this context probably doesn't apply to the, say, skydiving context, where I'm guessing parachutes provide a lot of benefit. So we always want to understand in a very precise way, well, what exactly happened in this research that the source cited for you? So if we go back to this question, I say, oh gosh, thank you for this advice about shaking hands. What's the best research you know of? And the speaker says, well, Clay Cook did this great study about positive greetings at the door. So if you go look that up, you'll see how persuasive it is. So let's go look at this research that Dr. Cook did. And it's always easy to find out who was in a study because there's always a section called participants. And what we see is that these are middle schoolers at schools in the United States, in case a cultural context matters. And it's racially and economically diverse, so that's good to know. It's not this small side part of the population. Oh, hang on a second. They chose students who were in classrooms typified by a high rate of disruptive and off-task behaviors. So this isn't a study about the effect of shaking hands with students. It's the effect about studying shaking hands with a very small particular subset of students. And that doesn't mean it's useless or not worthwhile, but it's good to know those are the students with whom their research was done. So what exactly did they do? And there were 4 steps. That there was some sort of positive connection at the door, which could be verbal or not verbal. They gave pre-corrective guidance. Hey, everybody, let's all take good notes today and don't kick the chair of the person in front of you like that. There are 4 steps here. So notice what's happened here. The source said that this is research that tells you that shaking hands at the door helps students. But it turns out that doing 4 things, one of which might include shaking hands, but certainly doesn't have to, might include shaking hands, benefits this particular subset of students. So again, that doesn't mean I should therefore ignore this research. If I teach disruptive 6th graders, doing these 4 steps is probably going to be really helpful to me. I actually don't teach disruptive 6th graders. I teach pretty well-behaved 10th graders. So I'm not sure this means I need to change my teaching practice based on this study. So we're always interested in, when we go look at this research, remember the source gave us research, so we look at it. Well, who was in the research? What did they do? Where did it happen? And does all of that match what the speaker said? And does it match the world that I teach in? That's what I wanted. Now, the next, oh, yes, there's a very particular piece of this here. I don't say always or never very much in this field. here's my never. Never change your teaching practice based on research into non-human animals. It does not matter how fast the mouse solved the maze. It doesn't matter until they do research with people. And I'm not making this up. This is actually published. Does dim light make us dumber? Spending too much time in dimly lit rooms and offices may actually change the brain structure, blah, blah, blah. So this was done with Nile grass rats. And I really want to know, how much time do Nile grass rats spend in their offices? So please do not use this research to change the way you teach until they check with people. It could be true with people, but we got to check with people. All right. The last insight goes like this. When we study psychology and neuroscience and teaching and learning in people, all of those things are fantastically complicated. So no one research study tells us everything that we need to know about a field. There's always going to be much, much, much more research out there. And so I'm going to share with you these three sources that I use all the time: Cite.ai, illicit.com, and connectedpapers.com. And these are three online sources that you can go to and sort of poke around and see what more you can learn about this particular field. So I'll just do one, since I think I've talked a little more than I should have done. Okay. Oh, this is frustrating. Sorry. Hold, please. Your call is very important to us. Okay, I fixed it. So the one that I want to tell you about is called Illicit. It's the most recent of the bunch that I found. And essentially, you go to Illicit and you ask it questions. So in this case, as you can see, I've typed in the question: does shaking hands with students as they enter the classroom increase attention, motivation, or learning? And then Illicit goes and it looks for as much research as it can find to answer this question. So this is the answer it came up with. So these are the top 4 papers, but you can look at as many as you like. So research suggests that physical touch, such as a handshake, can have a positive impact on student perceptions of their instructor. Well, actually, I don't want the students to have a positive perception of their instructor. I want them to learn more. So that doesn't do much for me. Student hand raising. Well, I'm not interested in hand raising at this moment. Touchless hand gesture. So as I just scroll down this list here and sort of poke around, what I'm finding is that there doesn't actually seem to be much research at all on this question of handshakes. It doesn't actually seem to be research-based advice. I looked, I really did, I looked. And if you go to cites.com or if you go to connectedpapers.com, you'll find the same thing, that it's really, I looked and I looked and I looked and I couldn't find any research supporting that. So I think those 3 sources, I know those 3 sources are the ones that I go to most often in order to try and find when someone says, well, this thing, research shows that doing this thing will help you teach better. This is my way of looking to be sure. Okay, I will stop there. But I hope that the point that I'm communicating is, if we know how to do this, we can start asking the sorts of questions which put us more strongly into that conversation and give us that stronger voice that I hope we get to have. Okay, I'm guessing there are questions out there and I should start answering.
We can get started with some of the questions we have. So, what's been the biggest, most impactful change you've seen arising from the work that you do?
Oh, so I think I just mentioned I was at a conference on Thursday, and the person told this story about the PD speaker saying you have to do the thing, and when she asked for research, the speaker said, well, you can just Google it. So I'm trying to help people feel like they get to have more of a voice and get to speak up and say, Thank you for the suggestion, and I get a vote here too. So this is a hard path to take in some ways, but I think it's starting.
I know you spoke a lot about this already, but what do you think, what else is needed to support teachers in implementing research in the classroom?
Ooh, so many answers. I think one question I get is, well, shouldn't everybody know how to do this? And my own answer is, I think probably not. I think one person per school should know how to do this. I think there should be somebody in every school who's actually really conversant in this set of strategies. So when the principal gets an advertisement saying, oh, you should try the thing, they can go through this process to investigate the thing. Or if somebody comes back from a conference says, oh, this amazing, inspiring speaker recommended we should all be doing the blah, blah. You've got the in-house expert who can say, well, if the speaker is saying that's a research-based strategy, then no, we shouldn't. And by the way, important point to make. My point is not research is the only way we can decide on good teaching practice. If somebody says, in my experience, doing this has been incredibly beneficial and you might try it, and you think, oh gosh, in my experience, that sounds like a great idea. That's great. We're teachers. We get to use our experience to decide how to do things. Research is good. I just want to be sure that people are using research-based claims appropriately.
Sylvia?
So I recently had a discussion about this with someone, and it was kind of, it's an obvious question, but I actually never thought of it before, is how do you help the educators know or teachers know that the behavior that they're actually doing is reflective of the research outcomes or what they are actually trying to do? So how do they like outside of receiving teacher training that is specifically guided for those research outcomes, if educators are seeing these things, these recommendations, they're like, okay, you know, I want to practice this in the classroom, what gives them, one, the confidence that they're doing it correctly, but also the assurance other than like just trial and error and just seeing it work with their children?
So am I right? The question is, I've heard the research-based suggestion I should do X. I want to do X. I'm trying to do X. Am I sure I'm doing X right? Is that your question?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, what's the right behavior that they're supposed to implement in the classroom?
So thank you for asking that, Sylvia. You've stumbled across an obsession of mine. So I've said this concerns me, and one way I'm working on this is to help teachers understand the series of steps that we might go through to participate in the conversation. Another strategy to get at this same point goes like this. I think this is least effective when research says, okay, here are the 10 steps, follow the 10 steps. I don't think research anywhere can tell teachers, here are the 10 steps, you have to do the 10 steps. When researchers tell us what to do, that's almost certainly not going to work. I think what research is great at doing is helping us think differently about what we do. So the mantra that I chant when I go to schools and I talk with teachers at schools, I say a dozen times an hour, I say, don't just do this thing, instead think this way. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm suggesting how to think about what you do. And if you think differently as the teacher, you will know what to do. So for instance, the topic I talk at schools about most often is working memory. So working memory is obviously essential in the classroom and essential for learning. And anybody who tries to take that insight and say, okay, here are 20 best practices in the world of working memory. Well, that might work in my 10th grade English classroom at the school where I teach. But if you're teaching third grade Montessori, if you're teaching at a Catholic school in Rio de Janeiro, or if you're teaching children on the spectrum, your context makes my best practices list nonsense. So I think what we as teachers should be looking for, Sylvia, is not what should I be doing, but okay, I hear what the advice is. How is that going to work with my fifth graders in these science lessons? Or with my dyslexic readers, what do I do with that? I think it's that thought process, not the checklist obedience process, is the best way to go from this to successful collaboration.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And even most of the projects that we've even done with educators, we were never able to actually, or we never felt in any way confident to tell them to be prescriptive in any way. It's usually, like, as you said, understand, or having educators understand how to think about the concepts. And then also, because the teachers themselves are also the ones who know the children within their classroom, and therefore they're able to apply that much better than any prescriptive plan that they might have. So that's great.
I'll give an example. I was working at a school, talking with a group of 5th grade teachers, and they were in a nonfiction unit, and they were reading a book that was the story of 3 immigrant journeys. And as the teachers, they loved the book. It was a wonderful book. And what was tricky is that each of the immigrant stories was coming from a different country and happened during a different century. And so there was an enormous amount of background knowledge that the 5th graders just didn't have. So they couldn't understand, why was this particular event in the plot so important? Because to understand that, you needed to know something about, I don't know, Pakistan and religion in Pakistan, which it was prior knowledge they didn't have. So their first thought was to pre-teach all of this relevant background knowledge. And they finally ended up deciding the amount of background knowledge the students would need to have isn't teachable in the amount of time that they had. So they switched to a different book. And that's a conversation. I couldn't have participated in the curricular decision at all. I don't know the book. I've never taught 5th graders. And because they had the concept of working memory and prior knowledge in mind, they were able to think their way through that very challenging, complicated, interesting, powerful set of questions in a very different way. And they ended up being quite happy with the nonfiction unit they taught. Anna, if you're asking a question, you're muted.
I'm muted. Thank you, Andrew. Curtis Kelly asks, I've noticed a real disparity of educator interest or knowledge in mind-brain ed. We in Japan are quite interested, Korea too, but what about in the US? Around Harvard for sure, but I get the impression that is spotty. In case, how can we promote it?
Other than your great blog.
Curtis is my favorite person here. The rest of you seem nice, but Curtis is definitely the best. Curtis, you're asking a system question, and I'm not great at system questions. I think part of the hesitation in a US teaching context is my impression is that teachers in the United States are relentlessly being told that they have to do the thing because they're bad and wrong. And why are you so bad and wrong? And why don't you do more of the thing that is I'm the flavor of this 6 months, so you have to do my thing. So my impression when I go to schools is there's a kind of a hunched, actually, I presented at a school about a year and a half ago, where the faculty were very angry with me at the end of my talk. And I met with a subgroup of them afterwards, and they vented at me for a while. And finally, one of them said, look, your thing was fine. Like, I buy your thing, whatever, working memory, great, I get it. But before that, like 6 months ago, we got training in this, we had to do this. And 3 months before that, and he was worked up. He was really angry at all of these things he's being required to do. So I think a lot of the hesitation is self-preservation. Like, I'm just trying to help my kids love Macbeth. Wait, and now I have to make kids love Macbeth your way, and wait your way, and wait your way. I'm exhausted. So I don't know enough about systems to know about how to control systems. I know enough that if you come and ask me questions, I can try and answer your questions. That's that's my place to intervene in the system.
Forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Yassine. Asks, says, it's great I also support the notion of teachers having research-based skills, but do teachers really have time and space to do so? Many UK-based teachers, for example, show huge interest in learning more about this, but what I keep hearing from them is this is probably for teachers who have personal interest in this, but can't be applied to all due to heavy workload and inconsistency between policymakers and practitioners. So I guess, like, what can you comment a little about that?
Yeah, so I think this particular talk that I just gave, this is a highly specialized topic. And as I said before, I think having one or two teachers in a school, I think having a committee in a school that does this particular evaluation work can be quite narrowly focused. At the same time, I think a concept like how does working memory work? That's absolutely crucial to all learning at every moment. So every teacher should understand that. And it's really our jobs as people who understand the intersection of these fields. We need to be able to come up with ways of talking about it and explaining it that people can understand. So I absolutely get your point that it's complicated. And it's so important we really have to be able to do it, because if in fact working memory limitations make it much harder to get ideas solidly into long-term memory in a way that students can remember and apply them in a different context later on, if that's true, and it's true, then teachers really genuinely do need to understand it, and we need to be good at explaining it.
Awesome. Okay, we have another question from an INVIS board member. What suggestions do you have for teachers whose time is already stretched to keep up with current research in a time-efficient way, especially since as new research comes out, claims change?
Well, Curtis would tell you that my blog is awesome. I again think there probably ought to be somebody in each school. If I were running a school, and thank heavens I'm not, I would think there ought to be somebody in the school whose job it is to do that, because it's absolutely true. There's an enormous amount of research racing past us. As Yassine says, it's complicated. It contradicts other research. So to take a simple example, if you've been in this world for a while, you've probably heard about spacing and interleaving as really good ways, desirable difficulties that promote long-term memory formation. And if you've been in this world for a while, you probably know about working memory limitations and the way that we need to teach within working memory limitations. And if you think about that for 15 seconds, you're going to say, but wait a minute, isn't desirable difficulty going to result in working memory overload? Isn't spacing and interleaving a recipe for working memory overload? Like this morning, you said don't overload working memory, and this afternoon, you're saying spacing and interleaving. What's going on? That's a great question. And the people who do research in those fields don't actually talk to each other an awful lot. So I don't think it's the teacher by teacher job to figure out what the priorities are. I think it's the professions and the school's job to sort, prioritize, explain well. And I don't remember who asked that question, but whoever asked that question, it's your job to say, okay, the principle is manage working memory load. So in my 12th grade class in the history of the Silk Road, this is how I'm going to apply that idea. That's the teacher's job. I don't think it's the teacher's job to process all of the research and prioritize it all. It's what I do for a living, and I'm pretty tired.
Great. We have time for one or two more questions. So if anyone else has a question before I ask, feel free to pop it in the chat. But what are some things researchers can do to pay attention more and listen more to educators based on what educators see in the field? What are some things researchers can do to support those needs?
So one thing I wish we heard more about is if I'm a teacher and I'm talking with a researcher and I say, what does your research show I should do? The researcher is going to answer the question, because that's the question I got asked. Like, my research shows this, so you should do this. I wish researchers in IMBIS world then took the next step and said, but oh, by the way, my research in this little thing right here suggests that you should do this, but researchers isolate variables and schools and teachers combine variables. So you should take my research finding into account as you're thinking about what you're doing. But there's so many other things that you also have to take into account. So it's always a balancing act. So I can tell you this, but I'm going to rely on you to figure out how to fold that into the mix that you've got. So sort of back to that whole working memory versus spacing and interleaving. Both of those research pools are correct in the narrow things that they're focusing on. Putting them together is an enormously difficult task. And the more that researchers remind us about their advice is specific but narrow, and let us know that. And Kristen has heard me rattle on about this at such great length. I especially wish that were true for people who research neuroscience. We teach at a time when neuroscience has such cultural power. All I have to do is say dopamine, and everybody will do what I say. And I'm here to tell you, until the psychology research confirms the advice that comes from neuroscience world, we really shouldn't do it. In the book, I write about dopitocin, which is the unholy combination of dopamine and oxytocin, that all you have to do is say dopamine or oxytocin, and everybody lines up behind you. And free advice. If anyone gives you teaching advice that includes the phrase hit of dopamine, walk away. You're done. That's not how dopamine works. That's not how dopamine works. Walk away from that advice. So those are the two things, highlight limitations and especially highlight neuroscience limitations.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for everything. This was fantastic and insightful and educational. And thank you for our interpreters and everyone who joined us today. The questions were awesome. Conversation was great. We're going to share the links and recommendations from today's AMA by email with everyone who registered. And as I said earlier, you'll get a link to the YouTube video once it's up. And our next AMA session is going to be March 20th. At 9 a.m. PST, 12 p.m. EST with Dr. Radhika Gosavi. We are very excited she's here on this AMA. So thank you all that came, and we're looking forward to seeing you on March 20th.
Sorry, I'd like to update that. It's Thursday, March 21st, an hour later. So we'll send the flyer out, we'll send the info out, more info coming soon.
And if I may, because radically the attention shifted away from me, and I want to bring it back. So I really like having this sort of conversation. So I hope that my email address is going to get shared in whatever information goes out. So if you have a question, if you want to keep talking to me, please do reach out. I genuinely do like talking about these ideas, and I'd love to keep talking with folks. Okay, the attention can shift away from me again.
Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it. And thank you again, Andrew. That was awesome.
Okay, thanks, everybody.